Thanks for listening to Convo with Kyle. My name is Kyle Bell. As a writer, an author, and a journalist, my work has always been about telling stories. But now, I want to tell a different story. I want to tell your story. The goal of this project is to share with you the stories of ordinary people who do extraordinary work. They may be your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, who want to make their communities and this world a better place for all of us. So let's start a conversation. Today we're joined by Dylan LeBlanc, a PhD candidate in history at the University of Notre Dame. So Dylan, is seeking a PhD what you expected it to be?
Yeah, it's a funny question because in some ways nothing is ever what you expect it to be, especially when you build it up in your mind as much as I did. I mean, I remember when I was in fourth grade, my parents went to a parent-teacher conference, and they came back, and I had just started to rebel. I was not doing the assignments because, frankly, I didn't want to do them. There was one project. It was a butterfly. We had to color the individual components and then cut it out and assemble it, and all my classmates were doing it, and I just didn't want to do it. So I threw it in my desk and didn't do it. And that started a downward spiral in my grades that year. And so my parents went to talk to the teacher, and apparently she told them, she said, Dylan will do really well in college. We just got to get him there. And because I didn't want to, if I wasn't interested in it, I wasn't going to do it. I wasn't going to just obey orders and just do it. So when I got to college, it was everything that I wanted it to be. It was I could study what I wanted to study. The course load itself was whatever you wanted it to be. I'd finally gotten to a point where I could study purely what interested me, and it sort of became an obsession. And as I got into my particular discipline, history, I sort of, you catch onto a project and you keep pushing that project and you chase it down to its sort of like its fullest extent.
What got you interested in history?
I think it was my great-grandmother, to be honest with you. My mother always had a real passion for history. She was just sort of a run-of-the-mill history buff in a lot of ways. And so I think when I grew up, I was always given a sense of, she was always reading books like by David McCullough and Doris Kearns Goodwin, sort of like really well-known popular historians. But I think also my great-grandmother, her parents are from Poland, and so that's the immigrant generation in the immigrant side of my family. And I was always fascinated by her connection with the past. So she would answer those questions, but could never fully answer them because she was, in her late 80s at this time and didn't have a perfect memory. So what she would tell me would be really fascinating about her life. So where did your parents come from? What did they do for a living? She could tell me what they did for a living. Where did they come from in Poland? She knew that they left from Gdańsk, the port town, but didn't necessarily know where they had been before or what they did before then. And so every question I asked her about her past and about our family's past led to more questions, and everything that she answered also left plenty of things unanswered. And I think through interviewing her, I literally would sit there with a tape recorder when I was in grade school and ask her all these questions about our family's past, and did that for a series of years, and I still have them, and I haven't systematically gone through them yet, but I want to one day. And I think it was in that context that I got in touch with the past. It created for me and raised for me questions that I couldn't yet answer, but that I wanted to find the tools to be able to answer them. And so I think that's probably where it started.
Did you say your great-grandmother?
My great-grandmother, yeah. So she passed. When did she pass? She passed in 2009, in her 90s. And so my family, they turned around kids real quick. Yeah, so she was born in 1919. Her family had been in South Bend since right around the turn of the century. Her father had stowed away on a ship from Gdańsk, and they were going to throw him overboard. At least that's what family legend says. But they sent him to work in the boiler room instead, and that's where he learned about engines. And he came here, and he was a mechanic and sort of a tinkerer and an inventor. And apparently, family legend says that he had created something for the steam engine, some sort of new thing that was going to vastly improve the steam engine right around 1928 or something. But the Great Depression hit, and he couldn't afford to go to Washington to get the patent, filed. And so he lost the opportunity. And the family interpretation is that we would have all been trust fund babies if he could have just gone to Washington and that the Depression hadn't have hit.
So you would have ended up at Harvard instead of Notre
You know,
Dame.
so yeah, East Coast, you know, nobility moved from the Great Lakes over. That's where my mother's side of the family is really rooted in South Bend that way. And
What do your parents do?
my mother is in real estate. My father is he resells Cisco like network gear,
Okay.
both in the South Bend area. So they've stuck around. Most people in my family have kids when they're in their early 20s, and so generations moved really quickly.
So you're the exception then.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, right. That's what happens when you pursue education farther and farther and farther. You put off other things in life.
As I'm sure you're well aware, the cost of higher education is on a lot of people's minds. How are you paying for your schooling, and what do you think of the cost of college today?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm one of the lucky ones, like extraordinarily lucky ones. So I don't have any education debt, and that puts me in a very slim minority for a lot of, I think, millennials in this country. My parents, through their sheer will and sacrifice, paid paid my tuition in undergrad. I compensated for that a little bit by getting about half in scholarships, and then they made up the other half, just paid for it in cash. And I mean, that was right at the heart of the recession too. So the amount of scrimping and saving and sacrificing they did, I don't think it's really ever even hit me fully. Sort of how much they sacrificed to make my undergraduate education free for me. I mean, I can't overestimate the value of that as a start. And then right out of undergrad, I applied to PhD programs and was lucky enough to end up at Notre Dame, where everyone is funded for 5 years with a basic living expenses stipend, and that's standard throughout throughout graduate school, whether it's the social sciences, the sciences, or the humanities. Most PhD candidates are funded for small salaries in the form of stipends for living expenses. And then there's another layer of fortune there that South Bend is such a cheap place to live. And so graduate students at Notre Dame, with their stipends, can lead decent lives. So through a series of just sheer blessings and luck, the little bit of work on my end, haven't had to pay for any bit of higher education. I see my friends struggle with it every day. I see my closest friends that I went to college with are struggling to establish themselves in life because, while I'm paying a mortgage for a house that I bought, they're renting while also paying a mortgage for their education, essentially. They're paying the same amount of money that I'm paying every month because they had to take 30, 40, 60, 80, $90,000 out over the course of 4 or 5 years to get a bachelor's degree.
Before they have to dig themselves out of a hole of a mortgage, they have to dig themselves out of a hole of a student loan.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's the cruel irony is that we moved past the 70s and 80s where you could just sort of go to high school, right, and go get a well-paying union job at a factory or do what my dad did, which is he got an associate's degree and moved to Washington, D.C. and just started working in sales and computer sales. His associates was in electrical engineering, so he knew basic things about electrical engineering, but started selling computers to the government in Washington, D.C. in the 80s. And that was all he needed. Today, there's the perception and the reality that to get anywhere beyond sort of like factory jobs, or which we obviously need, but to get anywhere in this like sort of yuppie world that we have idealized, where you work a 9 to 5, wear a suit every day, and and have benefits and be able to support a family like that. If that's the ideal, the BA has been, or the BS has been the ideal for that. It's been the gatekeeper.
Yeah.
But the irony is that gatekeeper is setting people farther back than they would be set back if they had just stopped after high school and taken up a trade. I know some people who are pursuing trades right now and who are apprentices to electricians or to plumbers, and they seem like the ones who have figured out the right path in a lot of ways, at least financially.
Yeah.
Because they're learning a skill, and
they're getting
paid to do it.
Yeah.
And why we can't establish that for the other skills that we need in our society, the financial skills, the business skills, the intellectual skills that range beyond the market, like historians, political scientists, people who research to improve society in all manner of different ways. We need to approach it maybe in a way that the trades approach it slightly with. That's no real solution, but I see. Yeah, I mean, my friends struggle all the time. I can't even count people I know who are just swamped with student loan debt, and this is not a unique story, right? The unique story might be the fact that I'm sitting here telling you that I don't have debt. That's shocking. That's like a rare bird, and
especially since you went to private university.
Right, and that the only people for whom that happens is someone who is ultra privileged, which I don't know if I would consider myself ultra privileged, or someone who has a family that just decides that that's the ideal that they're going to provide for their children, and works as hard as possible to make sure that that happens. And even those who believe that they want to do that for their children necessarily can't do it. And so I mean, I consider, that's a roundabout way to say that I consider myself so deeply fortunate in that regard. We have to fix the problem. The only thing that I would say about, how we might go about doing it is, it has to come from every end of society. Universities have to change the way they do things. Students have to change the way they think about education. Businesses have to change the way they think about what is an acceptable standard of experience for hiring someone. And as voters, we need to think about how we want our government to intervene in this, and what we want them to do, and what the state's role is. It can't happen. I think our political discourse today says it has to come from one end or the other, right? You just can't be a classics major anymore if you want to have a job, and unless you have money, and that's not the right way to think. But the other right way to think isn't necessarily to say that, well, we'll just have the taxpayer foot the bill, right? Or universities are going to lay off faculty, and we're going to shut down departments that aren't necessarily marketable. We can't put the burden on one sector of society. It has to come from every sector in a sort of coherent group, and I don't know who's going to be able to make that possible.
Why do you think liberal arts degrees, broadly speaking, not just history, but political science and everything else, why are they still valuable compared to, say, STEM degrees?
I think in one way we're going to see increased value in the liberal arts over the next couple decades is that I think in the past 10 years we've just started to produce so many more finance degrees and business degrees and engineering degrees, which we all need. We need STEM degrees, and we need business people, right? We need people with that set of knowledge and that set of skills. But they're also becoming a dime a dozen. I mean, we've seen this, I think, with the legal market, with people coming out of law school and not necessarily finding the high-paying jobs that they immediately thought they would get just because they have a JD. I mean, part of that's the economy. Part of that's the fact that there's a surplus of these degrees on the market. So if our culture starts to, continues to devalue the liberal arts like it has been, there are going to be fewer and fewer of these people who get these degrees. What can we do? If we're going to become like a more scarce commodity, what are the things that we liberal arts people sort of provide? And I think on one level, it's a set of soft skills, as we're told to sort of call it, right? You can't walk into a Fortune 500 company right now and look at their budget and look at their financials and sort of tell them how to get out of whatever problem they're in. Or I can't look at their marketing portfolio immediately and tell them where they should move with their next element of strategy. But what the liberal arts teaches you is how to think broadly, whether in terms of time or in terms of understanding the diversity of experiences that exist in our world. It teaches you how to think quickly, on your feet, to evaluate large, disparate amounts of evidence and quickly assemble them together and make sense of them in sort of ways that are understandable to a broad group of people. I think it teaches you empathy. I think reading literature, reading history, teaches you about the diversity of experiences in our world and makes you a better voter. It allows you to take stock of your own values, to expose yourself to values that exist in other parts of the world and in other people's minds. And it doesn't let you just spectate. I think when you get a liberal arts degree, you're forced to analyze those things, and you're forced to sort of reckon with them and place yourself in relation to them. And I think empathy and understanding in a global world is essential. And I think we're seeing the erosion of it in a lot of ways in different parts of the world.
So let's talk a little bit more about history specifically. I hear a lot of people say these days, they question the value of studying history. What's your response to that?
It could be a cliche, right? There's the cliche is, if you don't study your history, you're condemned to repeat it, right? And I don't want that to be my full answer to that question. But in some ways, you have to start with that, because every dictator starts to accumulate power in the same way. In our capitalist society in the United States, every recession has started in a similar way, with people speculating on wealth that didn't exist. starts in 1819. The 1880s and 90s, it happens again. It happens in the 1920s. It happens in the 80s. It happens in 2008, 2009, right? Patterns emerge in history. So for policymakers, I don't think there's a policymaker that is working right now that would tell you that they do their work in an atemporal context, that they do their work without thinking about the past or the future and trying to place current policy initiatives in a broader spectrum of time, right? As voters, if you don't have an understanding of not only your country's basic history, but your candidate's own past, right? I think this is one thing that Trump, got a free pass on in a lot of ways. One of the tactics against him was to bring up all these negative things about his past and all these character flaws that have been, presented with a lot of evidence over a long career. But people say, well, maybe he's not that person anymore, or well, I don't know what's in his heart. And then he takes office, and you see the team that he assembles, and you see the scandals that continue to pile up, and there are a lot of people currently saying, I told you so. And there's a sense in which if you understand someone's background, you can't predict, but it gives you a decent sense about where things are going. That's more political than I would probably like to go with that response. But
why don't you tell us some more about your research? You specialize in the slave trade, right?
I do, yeah. So my work is primarily on the 18th century British Empire. I look specifically at Charleston, South Carolina, or the Low Country in broad strokes, and I'm interested in the connections that developed during the 18th century between Charleston, South Carolina, and the Gambia River Valley in West Africa. And those connections were built entirely upon the transatlantic slave trade. So in that context, I look at government officials, minor government officials. So in a lot of times when we talk about the colonial period and we talk about the state, we're talking about governors and we're talking about elected assemblies. And in many ways, right, these elected assemblies are the ones who hold on to their English liberties, and eventually, members from these assemblies will go on to form the Continental Congresses, right? And so there's this sort of, right, historians have been fascinated by the sort of the cling to liberty in these assemblies. And
yet the slaves have no liberty.
Right. There's obviously that huge contrast and the irony, and historians have understood that for a long time, that in early America, the place where freedom meant the most and where people clung to freedom hardest were the places where the majority of the population was slaves. And that slavery says something about how we perceive freedom, and that if you're living in a place where most people aren't free, you're going to be much more deeply attached to your own liberty. So that's the broad context that I look at, but I look at government officials below sort of the level of governors and assemblies. I look at minor people who seem to make no sense and have no purpose in our understanding of really anything in this time, like customs collectors, secretaries, all these minor government officials. And I use them to really ask questions about what's the relationship between slavery and empire in the 18th century, and what's the relationship between personal wealth, corruption, ambition, and slavery at this period as well. And so what I look at is these government officials, how they try to acquire power, how they try to use power, both in the Gambia River Valley, where the British had a small formal presence in a fort in the middle of the river, essentially, and then a much larger formal presence in a place like Charleston. How these individuals use state commissions, not only to support slave society, because in some ways in many ways they're individual duties and responsibilities, working in bureaucratic offices or working on the docks to inspect incoming goods. That labor is entirely about supporting the plantation complex, but it's also for them making them a lot of money. And a lot of them are corrupt. They're using their position on the docks as custom collectors to engage in illegal trading and to smuggle. They're using their positions in basically what are public record offices to embezzle money and property, and they're using their position on courts as whether as clerks of the courts or as judges themselves to sort of get their friends acquitted and level charges against their enemies. And so there's a lot of intrigue and corruption that's going on in this context too. So really my project is trying to study how these imperial slave trade connections persist over the course of the 18th century, but how the individual ambitions of people who have a minor degree of state power make this all happen. But it's very, very much in its formative stages right now. I'm just writing my first chapter, so we'll see. I'll have a better answer for you in 2 years.
What drew you to the slave trade?
I think it's the city of Charleston. I vacationed there a lot as a kid, and I continue to go there every year with my family. It's a place that I think my family's really attached to. Like we love the city. We love that place. It's a place that has good memories, and but at the same time, it's a place with a dark history, and it's the place where if I encountered history with my great grandmother in person, I also encountered it in a different way in person in Charleston, right? So the fascination that I developed with asking my grandmother questions and trying to strive for more answers with our family history. When I got to Charleston, you see these buildings that you walk downtown, and it's basically just like it's the 18th century all over again. These buildings have been preserved so beautifully, and plantations have been preserved so beautifully that you can step back in time without much effort. Once you get back there in time, you encounter a history that we don't like to think about a lot, but that we're confronted with on a daily basis. We're confronted with the legacies of this institution all the time. And so for me, Charleston was a place that really captured, I think, everything that we're supposed to be thinking about as historians. We're supposed to be thinking about a past that's meaningful to understanding how we got to the present, but also we're supposed to be understanding a past that continues to rear its head in the present, and that we can't deal with our present moment without reconciling ourselves with the past and reckoning with its consequences. So it's more than just being an antiquarian and saying, oh, look at how beautifully this city's been preserved. It's about going to a place that is, yes, beautiful in its own right and is a cultural treasure in its own right, but that presents problems for us, and problems that historians have a place in terms of solving, in terms of having these conversations. I mean, you look at the Emanuel shooting in 2015 that put Charleston again at the center of this discussion about racism in the United States, and the North Charleston shooting when the police officer shot him in the back. It placed that city again at this. It's always been at the center point. It was the place where the South first seceded from the Union. It was the place where slaves first became a majority population in the 18th century. It was the first place that became a quote-unquote black majority in colonial America, at least on the continent. So it's always been at the center of, I think, race relations in the United States. It's always been at the center of not just race, but also sort of the other economic consequences of slavery. And now it's at the center of like culinary excellence and tourism in the United States. So we're blending all these positive and negative things in one place, really, for me, raised so many questions that I just continue to look for answers. And that's probably how I got on this project. I mean, there are a lot of that's the story I'm going to tell today. It changes depending on how I'm thinking about it.
Speaking of Charleston, South Carolina has been at the center of many controversies over the years. But until just a few years ago, the Confederate flag flew at the state capitol. But more recently, we've been seeing a move to remove Confederate monuments in places like New Orleans. As a historian, what are your thoughts on the removal of Confederate symbols in the South?
Right. So the idea is the Confederate flag heritage or hate? Yeah, and so as a historian who studies the South, but as a pure Yankee, a guy who has lived the vast majority of his life in the Great Lakes region, I'm in a weird position, right, to think about this. I'm not a Southerner, and so I have sort of critical distance in that world. And yeah, the Confederate flag is heritage, but it's heritage that was built on the forced enslavement of millions of people. And so if you're going to say it's heritage, you can't cherry pick that heritage, right? Yes, the Confederate States of America was a sovereign state that established itself through violence, and it tried to defend its sovereignty, and it lost. And that memory, the memory of that struggle, the memory of that way of life, is a powerful tool for people in the South, white people in the South. In many ways, the only reason that poor whites signed on to the whole slavery thing was because of the structures of white supremacy, that by their race they were lifted up, right? And that supremacy doesn't exist without the system of oppression that slavery was. So for people, the flag and other elements of Confederate heritage provide a way to lift themselves up in a world where they see their privilege shrinking, in a world where they see their jobs going away, and they see it's harder and harder for them to make ends meet every day. I think for some people, the Confederate flag is reassuring. It's reassuring for them in a world that's becoming dominated by what they call political correctness gone mad. And it can be all those things. That's fine. You can say that that's what it is for you. But you can't then turn around and say that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, or that flag doesn't in fact represent slavery and nothing but slavery.
What do you think of people who say that the Civil War wasn't about slavery?
They're wrong. They're wrong. The Civil War was about states' rights. It absolutely was. But it was about states' rights to choose whether or not they were going to have slavery or not, and whether or not slavery was going to push west and continue to push west, and that's the core issue. The core issue was every single major political or legal issue in the antebellum. Yeah, it was absolutely about slavery. It was, and you can't get around it. If you say it's about states' rights, it's about states' rights to have slavery, and that not only is that the historical consensus, but it's backed up by the evidence. I mean, you read these documents, you read the papers of Jefferson Davis, right? And the Confederacy was built on the principle that black Americans were subjugated to white Americans. That is the founding principle by one of its founding fathers, explicitly saying this thing. Right?
They were property.
Yeah, they were property. That's 101 level stuff.
Yeah.
Right, for this region and for this in that time period. But we struggle with this as historians in terms of figuring out how to teach this, because in a lot of ways, when you're trying to teach the first half of the U.S. survey in college to college kids, you want to sort of dismantle a lot of prejudices that they came into, into college with. One of those prejudices a lot of times is the South, the Civil War was about states' rights, not about slavery, right? So by dismantling it, you put slavery at the center. At the same time, if you talk only about slavery in the first half of the 19th century leading up to the Civil War, you also do discount some of the more complex political realities that created that war. Why were the Lincoln-Douglas debates so heated? Because Lincoln and Douglas were trying to think out loud in a very nuanced way about how the state was to relate to slavery and how sovereignty was going to be distributed from the federal government to the states, and what's the relationship between those powers. And there were a variety of different answers to that. Ultimately, all these things circled back to the problem of the fact that slavery had created a different region in the South, and that region was separating in many ways from the North, that they were not only intertwined inexplicably, but were pursuing two different courses of life by the 1830s. You want to present students with nuance, but sometimes that nuance does undermine the central message, which is the Civil War was about slavery. And a lot of times students will come away from a nuanced narrative of the Civil War and say, well, it was about slavery, but it was also about all these different things. All these different things, in the end, came back to that institution.
See, I kind of think that Lincoln, as a figure in history, has been immortalized in a lot of ways. What do you make of the fact that he is made as the great emancipator when, really, if you look at the history of it, he did not go into office with a set agenda to free the slaves of the South?
Right. Yeah, and that's
his goal was to preserve the Union.
Absolutely, and if that meant the South came back in with slavery, at a certain point that was acceptable to him. I mean, I just finished assisting with my advisors big survey course, the first half of the U.S. survey, so from the 17th century to the end of the Civil War, and so huge lecture course, and every Friday you have the large lecture courses, but every Friday you go have a discussion section with a graduate student, and so yeah, that was one of the last things I talked about with my students, that we watched the film Lincoln after they had read, had gone to lectures about Lincoln, and then had read they read portions of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and they read, really had a good textbook that they were using, but then saw the way Daniel Day-Lewis portrays Lincoln and the way Spielberg wants to set up his character, and I think it opened a lot of their eyes, that and reading the other texts, that Lincoln is the only politician I think both parties agree was like infallible in a lot of ways. Both parties want to claim him, and no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, you're okay with Lincoln. Like, Lincoln had a hell of a job to do, and he did it well. But I mean, Lincoln was also a man of his time, and he was a politician. He was thinking purely as a politician. How can I preserve this union with as little strife and as little bloodshed as possible? And at a certain point in time, that meant the South coming back in with slaves. And recognizing that is really important, to say that freedom and emancipation in this country is a tool, an ideological tool, as much as it is an ideal of life, and that we want to ascribe easy connections between political figures of the past and the ideals of our current society. But history shows that doesn't work. What does that mean for how we think about current political discourse? That's an open question. But so then in some ways that's one of the struggles. Historians, our job is to complicate. Yeah. Popular narratives are always too simple.
Yeah.
We're supposed to complicate. But in some ways, complicating will sit uneasily with our individual politics, right? Because if I want to emphasize that slavery is a core institution in this country in terms of the way that it shaped not only its history but its present day thinking, I'm going to hammer that point home as much as possible, and that is true, and I believe that to be true, and I can back it up with evidence and with scholarship. But if I want to be a good historian, in moments like the first half of the 19th century, I might want to be a little bit more nuanced and say that, yeah, there were other things on Americans' minds politically besides slavery, and that there were other things that went into freeing the slaves besides just recognizing slavery as an abhorrent condition. And as historians, we can sit there and understand that yeah, we can have this nuanced understanding and sort of divorce it from politics. But there will be people on the on other ends of the political spectrum who are very intelligent but will cherry pick complex notions, say, see, it was more complicated, therefore people going on and on and on about slavery, you should just shut up. It's over. It doesn't have any ramifications anymore because it was more complicated than that. It wasn't the sole thing that this conflict was about anyway. So we have to walk a fine line.
Well, I mean, I think in many ways, historical figures are whitewashed both as villains and as heroes. You look at Mount Rushmore and other symbols of the United States, and we like to have these heroic figures and point to them as the good guys.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But part of your job as a historian is to point out that they were men.
Right.
They weren't gods.
Right. Yeah.
They had flaws.
I think one of the things that history puts you in touch with is something, I don't want to get too philosophical, but human nature. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think historically, so I think human nature is not a static thing. For me, human nature is revealed over time through human actions. This is how we understand what something is. We watch it do what it does. And that can complicate your preconceived notions, or it can reinforce them. And so that in that way, history is a hugely political tool. But the positive way to spin that is that understanding the position, say, Lincoln was in when he took office, really thinking about that and thinking about the intense feelings and visceral emotions on both sides and just sheer amounts of wealth and power that were at stake and human lives that were at stake in this conflict and how he had to sort of navigate that. If you don't come out of that reading more empathetic, then you're numb from like the chest up, because like that's one of the things history should teach you, is to be more cautious in your judgment, to be more empathetic, to think a little bit more deliberately and slowly about how you assign blame to people in certain instances or controversies. So yeah, I think that's certainly one thing that we can bring to the table.
So really the first draft of history is written by the news media.
Yeah.
And the media right now is under a lot of pressure. It's under attack. The President of the United States says that the news media is the, quote, enemy of the people. As a historian, does that make your job more difficult, dealing not only with the fact that media is kind of under assault at the moment, but also that there's this surge in fake news?
Does it make it more difficult in what way?
Future historians.
Oh, okay.
So in evaluating our present day, 50, 100 years from now.
Sure. Well, I think, in one way, I think the rise in fake news makes historians' jobs as teachers a lot easier, because journalism, the news, rhetoric in public has always been politicized. And one of the first things we want to teach students as historians is identify the bias in the agenda in whatever you're reading. Don't take what you're reading at face value, because the author has an agenda. The author has a certain socioeconomic context that explains why he's doing certain things, or he or she is doing certain things. So I mean, that's day one stuff, right? But it's stuff that we want to keep reiterating over time. And what I've experienced in the past year teaching students at Notre Dame in the context of the election in the first 100 days of Trump's administration is that it's easier to emphasize bias in history when they're seeing it all the time. They might have before this election not only, I mean, there's a sense I think among people that, well, CNN is sort of centrist, MSNBC is left, and Fox leans really far right. But at the same time, I think there's an illusion of objectivity in the way that we read the news sometimes that Trump has blown the doors off of. He has been completely candid about how narratives become politicized. And while the narratives he's fighting, many of us feel are more grounded in facts and more defensible, at the same time, he's exposed the fact that both of these narratives are constructed. One is probably better constructed and more constructed in a more reliable way. But so in that way, we've started to have a debate about how you construct narratives, and narratives that were assumed to be fact, like crowd size, suddenly becoming inexplicably complicated and challenged. Even if you can see through the illusion and say you're full of it, it still shows you from a student's. It makes it easier as teachers for us to go into the classroom and say, "Look at what he's doing." You'll see this throughout history. Think about if the author you're reading has a similar agenda to Trump or to anybody in the news media that you're seeing spinning an agenda. Where's the spin? So the more sensitive we are to spin, the easier historians' jobs as teachers become. In the future, yeah, I think historians are going to have.
What are historians going to make of Donald Trump's Twitter account?
Yeah, I mean, I love Twitter where it says whenever you're tweeting at the president or the vice president, it's in his bio. It says tweets may be archived, right? And the Library of Congress, I think a couple years ago, bought the Twitter archive, and so there's a self-consciousness about being part of an archive now as you're tweeting, and some of these people really should reflect on that. But future historians are going to have to deal with social media, presuming that we maintain the information, presuming that the servers are still that the databases and the archives of the internet actually do what they're supposed to be doing, right? There's a lot of work now to preserve the internet in different formats to make sure that it's accessible for historians in the future.
I mean, and there's a lot of questions whether these things will actually exist in the same way that clay tablets exist.
Right. So it could be a smorgasbord for historians, more evidence than any historian has ever had ever, with more powerful technology to search it and make sense of it and analyze it, like in mass quantities, to do text mining, to do different sorts of analytics that would allow you to track patterns and understand what real regular people were thinking every day, because you can go back and see who I was talking trash to on Facebook on June 1st, 2006, right? That's something that most historians have never had. So if we can maintain that, it's going to be a great blessing for future historians. But it's also going to be a curse, because how do you make sense of a society that is so self-absorbed, so cynical, so deeply sort of consumed with producing and consuming at the same time, right? The amount of media content that we produce on a daily basis is just absurd. And so historians will have the huge problem of having to make sense of all that and come up with a master narrative.
Information overload.
It's information overload, and we have that in universities too, where there's more scholarship being produced than needs to be produced right now, because we can't keep up with it. People can't keep up with a lot of historical scholarship and make broad narratives out of it. That's one of the crises of the field. So how do you write a political history of Trump when you can put him in very intimate context with these Twitter trolls? I don't know. I'm excited to see what happens. I think the first great meme history is still waiting to be written. So that's.
Are you going to be the author of that?
I actually really would love to be. It's one of my ideas. Yep.
There you go.
I will plug it first on your podcast.
Okay.
I'm actually completely serious when I talk about this book.
Are you?
Yes, because I think memes are such a beautiful way to track popular culture and popular politics in the post 9/11 world. I think you can find everything you need there to make sense of.
Is it like today's equivalent of a political cartoon?
Yeah, but it's so much more democratized and so much more malleable.
Yeah.
It's a political cartoon, but it's also like it's what I'm trying to. I don't know if there's political cartoon is a good one.
What do you make of the coarseness of dialogue in today's culture, and also how corrosive do you think that is to a democracy?
To a democracy, yeah, I think. I mean, in some ways, I'm not surprised by the coarseness of public discourse because I think we're just more aware of it now than we were in the past. I think. I mean, I read political documents from the 18th century that are just as crazy and just as shrill as Alex Jones, if not more shrill, right? You know, try to come after a slave owner's right to own slaves, and you want to see shrill, like that's shrill. That's like you're trying to go after a man's livelihood, a man's ability to control other people, right, and own other people and to exploit them in any way they wants, right? He's going to hold on to that as hard as he can. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not surprised by the coarseness of our discourse. I think we are just more aware of it now. I think you can find radical, shrill dialogue in any period you're looking for it, but I think the problem does come with the democracy portion of that question. Whereas now, not only are we a more democratic society than we ever have been, we're not very democratic, but we are still more democratic than we have been. We have a higher level of participation. The internet's bringing people together in ways that people have never been brought together before. Things are so much more visible. Our public sphere has been expanded exponentially. And so, yeah.
One of the ironic things is that as social media spreads and people participate more in democracy, it seems that the coarseness actually comes out and is more obvious.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because I think, I mean, and maybe that's something about human nature. Now, again, not to get philosophical, right? But maybe
we don't want any of that.
We don't. You know, I have that's my other degree, right? It's just brush that degree off, but I didn't pursue that in graduate school for a reason.
Right.
But it's yeah, I do think that in terms of what is human nature is what humans do, and I think we're just seeing it more and more and more and more in our faces every day. This has always been politics. Politics has always been intense. It's always been coarse. It's always been cynical. But there is a danger in everyone's cynicism, everyone's coarseness, everyone's fanaticism being broadcast to everyone else in the world. And when you have a few strong men who rise up to sort of be able to exploit that, I think it's clear what we get. We get Trump, we get Le Pen, we get Nigel. I mean, so much of the English-speaking world is essentially losing its collective mind right now because of the media technology that are available to disseminate views. I think that were always already there and have always already been there.
It's just easier for those views to spread now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I'm saying nothing original here, but I think it bears repeating that we're in touch with more views and more diversity than we ever have been before, and they're great. But it's also there are going to be people who push back against that, and some of that diversity is going to be diversity is horrifying and terrible, and we should never have it, right? So how do we deal with that in a democracy?
And some of that diversity is repugnant.
Some of that diversity is right. The only thing we should be intolerant towards is intolerance, right? That's sort of well, it's free speech, it's my religious liberty. In some ways, you're right, but like at a certain point, a political spectrum or a political group like the left needs to say no. Like we're putting our foot down at a certain level, right? And so we love diversity as long as you internalize certain values, right? And I think a lot of people on the left don't like to open up about that. We can be just as uncompromising, but I think the uncompromising thing, the things that liberals won't compromise on, generally are those things that tend to hurt society and tend to take us back to a place in time where more people were oppressed. And so, it's okay to not tolerate that, right? Our discourse has become coarse, but it's also become simplistic, right? That our political spectrum, our public sphere is a debate between those who want tolerance and those who are intolerant, those who want diversity and those who want just white men running the world, right? And it actually isn't that simple, right? Because liberals have a politics of intolerance as well. In fact, that's exactly what we run on in a lot of ways. That we're not going to stand for this behavior coming from a person like Trump, or coming from, state legislatures, in terms of what they do with religious liberty and defunding education, defunding, women's health organizations.
Dylan, can you talk a bit about your research in the field and the importance of getting your hands on primary sources?
Sure, that's the bread and butter of historians, right? I mean, we are creatures who deal in old documents, and our evidence is textual for the most part, and that evidence is held in archives that are becoming increasingly digitized, and therefore more accessible to a wider population, and also just more accessible from the Starbucks at the corner, without having to get on a plane and going somewhere. But travel for research is still really essential to the work. So what I do, since I work on the 18th century British Empire, most of my work is centered in the archives in Britain, mainly the National Archives, in London, British Library in London as well. But then also, since I work on South Carolina, there are some archives in Charleston and in Columbia, South Carolina, that I go to as well.
You went to Jamaica, right?
I went to Jamaica. Yeah, that was an experimental part of my research. I was thinking that my project was going to be on Jamaica, and that was an eye-opener. There's a lot of material in Jamaica that historians have used and can continue to use, but it's certainly a different archival infrastructure than would exist in Charleston or the United Kingdom. So it's a developing country. It's a country that doesn't have a huge amount of resources to devote to archives. So that means that they're not very well preserved, and they're not very accessible. So they're very protective. So you can't take pictures of the texts in the archives, despite the fact that they are sort of decaying and sort of hard to access, because researchers coming to Jamaica for archival research are stimulating the economy, right? And they're participating in tourism, and that is visitors to the Kingston area that Jamaica can't afford to lose. So you see, while the imperial archives in places like Britain and the United States, those that are participating in empire currently, or those that are parts of empires from the past, basically archives in developed countries are really sort of at the forefront of digitizing these old texts and making them available to people online. Those that exist in developing countries are protected more, at least in my experience, as cultural resources that should be only accessible in that country. And so, which in some ways it makes a lot of sense. Makes it a little harder on the researcher, but it is something we still need to respect and recognize. So I went to Jamaica to do that for about a week, poked around in the archives there, got a feel for things. I may go back, but the project has taken a different turn back up to South Carolina, in part because it's just easier to access. And if you're going to get a PhD done in 5 years, you've got to be able to get to your archives quickly, to spend a lot of time there and get a lot of work done without necessarily having to go to 5 or 6 different countries. In my case, I only need to go to like 3 archives to do the project, and that's concentrated enough to get it done in 5 years.
So, we're a couple of white guys having a conversation about slavery and, Civil War history. Both of us grew up in South Bend. We're both pretty far removed from the topic that we're covering.
Yeah. Where is our place in this conversation?
Yeah.
So I've been asked this before.
Have you?
If you're going in the direction
that is the direction I'm going.
Yeah. One of the candid answers is that my project is actually about white men and the horrible things they do to people. So, in some ways, my project is about slavery and how white men in government profited off of it. But in other ways, my project is about white men in government and their corrupt activities. So, in that way, slavery is the essential context, yet it is still a context, right? So I haven't necessarily figured out the specific relationship between my project and slavery. But from a pedagogical standpoint, as a teacher, it does put you in a weird position. I mean, I think as a white man, my presence in like a classroom that's talking about slavery is to facilitate a conversation about evidence, to facilitate a recognition of the contours of an institution and its continuing impacts on our society, while also sort of like not inserting myself and my own politics into that. As a professor, as an educator, it shouldn't be about you, it should be about the subject matter, right? So the farther removed I am from my students' minds, the better. At least in those sensitive topics. A course about slavery should never be about me as a white man, right? I have to grapple with racial identity and racial politics in the class and in the classroom, and in the subject matter itself. And so it's something that I haven't necessarily totally worked out yet. I haven't had any negative experiences doing it at Notre Dame, but I mean that's a very white institution, right?
Yeah.
So these conversations will be different at different universities and at different regions. For example, I was having conversations with people, graduate students at the University of Georgia when I was visiting there, deciding where I was going to go to do my PhD, and asked them a few questions about, well, how do you teach slavery as a white man in the South in this context? And I heard a litany of stories of awkward classroom confrontations between students of different backgrounds who had different preconceived notions about what the institution was in the South, what the war was about, what slave life was like, and these things become politicized very quickly there. I haven't had to deal with much of that in my career yet. But my approach is to let the evidence speak for itself and to remove my own identity from the conversation as much as possible, while also not backing down on the facts that historical consensus has shown us. And facilitating a conversation about race and about the legacies of this institution. One of the things that people should walk away with, especially if they're a white college student, from learning about slavery, is they should be critically thinking about whiteness as much as they should be thinking about any other type of racial politics in the United States. They should be thinking about what white privilege means and what white supremacy means and what its origin is. And so one of the places that I'm well positioned as a white man to speak candidly about is white supremacy, right? I can be candid to white students about the sort of system of oppression that has created their privilege. And in that way,
do you feel like you have an obligation?
I think we do. I mean, I think we have an obligation to present a narrative about the past that is consistent with the evidence, but one that also gives students an opportunity to grow as citizens and as people by challenging their preconceived notions and by giving them complex pieces of evidence to analyze in a supportive but also critical environment. So we shouldn't be talking about history in a vacuum, right? We should be engaging with problems that crop up in our present day as they relate to the past. So we are having a renewed moment of racial discourse in this country, and we shouldn't shy away from that. My own racial identity as a white man is, my own privileged identity as a white, straight, cis male, right, it's in the room, right? But that's all it is. It's in the room. I have an obligation to check that at the door and to facilitate a conversation about the past. But at the end of the day, it's all imperfect, and so you get questions. Yeah, how can you teach slavery as a white man? Well, I'm doing it, so that's how, right? But I do it cautiously, and with respect, and with openness to different to privileges that I have and to oppression that I haven't perceived or experienced in my own life.
So you're planning a trip to London over the summer. Can you tell us a little bit about what you hope to accomplish while you're there?
Sure. So most of my time will be spent, well, it's going to be a diverse trip. I'm going to spend about June doing archival research for my next couple chapters in the dissertation, or the book, as I need to be thinking about it. I need to be thinking about this as a book, not a dissertation. So most of that time will be at the National Archives in London, which is just a huge repository of all the British government materials that have been generated for centuries. And I'll be combing through that, primarily the South Carolina and Gambia River Valley documents, and gathering evidence for these next few chapters. Most of this involved just opening folders and boxes and taking pictures with my phone, and just taking as many pictures as I can in a day, loading it up onto an external hard drive, and creating a mobile archive that I'll go through later. There'll be some programs that I'm involved with Notre Dame as well. Notre Dame has a relationship with Oxford, the University of Edinburgh, where we send graduate students over to Britain every year to sort of engage in a colloquium. We all submit a chapter, and it's pretty circular. Everybody reads everybody's chapter and then, has conversations about improving it and stuff like that. So it's sort of a conference symposium sort of thing. So I'll be doing that in both London, Edinburgh, and Oxford for a couple days. and then ending it with a little bit of vacation. So it should be fun. About 6 weeks, 7 weeks.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
What's your ultimate goal that you hope to accomplish once you finish your PhD at Notre Dame?
A job would be nice. A job is the number one thing, right? So I started this whole process really idealistic. Always just wanted to study what I wanted to study. And college gave me the opportunity to do that. And graduate school gave me the opportunity to do more of that. And somewhere in these past few years, I realized I need to put food on the table. And the job market for academics right now is horrible. I'm told it's always been horrible, but it's more horrible now. So, I have one fellow student who just got a tenure track job, which is very encouraging. Hopefully that's the beginning of a pattern, not just a blip on the radar. But at the same time, I'm thinking openly about the future. And I used to think that I would go to grad school and then I would get a tenure track job as a professor at a university, and then I would live the rest of my days in tenured bliss, and that would be it. I'm more flexible these days. I also think that I want to be involved in public life a bit more than perhaps you would be allowed to be, or have time to be as a faculty member. So,
have you ever thought about running for office?
I have, yes. The time is not right yet. I have to find the place and the people. I have to build the connections and find the right opportunity. I think I'm not alone among millennials in thinking about running for office in this current environment. I think that a lot of our fellow generation has been really frustrated and inspired at the same time by our political climate. So I think I'm part of a surge in civic engagement, but I'm still looking for the right place to break into that. It's hard to balance the isolation of academia and the relentless engagement of politics. So I've decided to sort of finish one and then move on to the next one if the opportunity presents itself. I'm talking so much I'm sweating. You could start the podcast off of that.
Well, Dylan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was a great time.
I'd like to thank you again for listening to Convo with Kyle. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more episodes. You can also keep the conversation going on social media by visiting facebook.com/convowithkyle and twitter.com/convowithkyle. I'd love to hear from you.